Okay, so in this presentation, I am going to discuss the data analysis procedures that people follow when doing qualitative research. So as the Creswell chapter discusses, there's a lot of different ways that qualitative researchers approach data analysis. So I'm going to give you some basic tips and principles from my experience and drawing on his readings. But I want you to realize that this is just my perspective and his perspective, and there are certainly other just as valid best practices out there. So if you've taken a qualitative class in the past, perhaps, and you've learned different techniques there, those are equally useful and applicable to the process of conducting qualitative data analysis. So the process of qualitative data analysis differs from quantitative data analysis in several ways. It's not just that you're working with words versus working with numbers. There's also the process itself is different. So in quantitative research, remember, what you do is you collect your data, then you analyze it. So you don't start analyzing your data before you're done collecting it. For instance, if you send out a survey and you get back 4 surveys, but you're anticipating you're going to get back 20, you wouldn't start running your analyses with just the 4 surveys. I mean, if you had your means and standard deviations on just the 4 surveys, you're going to have to update that as the other surveys come back. So it's a very linear process of analyzing and collecting the data when you're doing quantitative research. You start analyzing after you're fully done collecting your quantitative data. In qualitative research, however, it's different. This is what Creswell was talking about when he discussed the idea of analytic induction. Essentially, your data analysis starts when you are collecting the data. So you'll usually do maybe 1 or 2 interviews, and then you'll start analyzing your data right away to see what seems to be emerging. And you might shift or change your data collection procedures based on those interim or preliminary analyses. One of the things I want to note is the idea of memoing. So Creswell discussed this too. So it's the idea, almost like as a researcher, you should be keeping a journal, I guess, as you're collecting your data, and be taking notes as to how you see your research questions being answered going along. And then at the end of the process or throughout the process, you should keep referring back to your memos to see kind of how the analyses are going. When you reach a point at which you can stop collecting data, that's what's referred to as theoretical saturation, right? And I referred to this in my last presentation too. So basically it's the idea that you're done collecting your data. No more new themes are emerging, the interviews or the documents or the observations you're doing. The idea of saturation, that's when you're done collecting data in qualitative research. Okay, so typically, qualitative researchers will transcribe their data. So essentially they convert their interviews or observational notes and memos, everything like that, into text documents. And so the whole idea behind doing this is that it makes you put your data in a more usable form. It's easier to analyze it when it's in front of you in the form of text. And typically if you're going to use a qualitative data analysis computer program, you'll want it to be in text form. Definitely those of you who are planning to do interviews for your action research project, you should consider transcribing the data. I know it can seem like it's a huge pain to do that because I transcribe data myself, and it takes a long time to. But once you have it in front of you, it's much more usable than if you're using just audio files and trying to pick out themes that are emerging from just audio files. Having your data in front of you in transcription form helps you to be able to code it. So essentially coding is when you go through the data and you read it line by line. And so what you're looking for are themes that are emerging from the data, right? That's the whole process and purpose behind coding. So first of all, the idea of segmenting is when you go through your data set, or your qualitative data, and you're dividing it into meaningful analytical units. So I'll give you an example in a second. But basically the idea is that coding is related to your segments. So you'll go through and you'll say, hey, this sort of chunk of data or this segment of data seems to be representing this idea or this concept. And so coding is when you assign label or symbols or meaningful sort of marks to your different segments of data. What I would suggest as you go through and code is that you'll be going through your data set itself, and you'll be coding in your transcript. But then also it's a good idea in a separate file to keep and develop a master list of codes that you're developing. Essentially, that is just all of the codes that you have identified in your transcripts, across all of your different transcripts. It's useful to keep a master list of those because it can get overwhelming to work with just the transcripts themselves. All right, so here's an example of a transcript that is from a research project I worked on. So you'll see we asked a question about academic culture at a university, and a professor was responding to our question. And I went through and I segmented out several sections of his response that seemed to capture the specific code of academic rigor. So you'll see here I underlined or highlighted in the text several different pieces of what he said, and I assigned the code of academic rigor to those different data segments. So that's basically what coding is in its simplest form. Going through, marking sections of text, and then assigning labels or theoretical codes to those different segments. So there's a couple of different basic pieces of terminology that I want to emphasize related to coding. So first of all, inductive coding is the process that you'll probably follow. So it's just when you go through your transcriptions and your data line by line, and you come up with code sort of on the spot. That's the process of inductive coding. Occasionally, researchers will come to their study with what's called a priori codes. So it's if beforehand you have an idea of the codes that you're going to be looking for, and you come with already sort of this master list developed. But typically, most researchers follow inductive rather than a priori coding process. Another thing I want to highlight is that you shouldn't feel like each segment of your data will only have one code. There can definitely be what's called co-occurring codes. So that's the idea that maybe one piece of data or one segment of data can be coded with multiple different codes. So don't feel as though, okay, so I read what this person said and it fits in with this idea. Keep your mind open to the possibility, at least, that there could be more than one code captured in someone's response. Okay, so a best practice in qualitative research is when multiple coders are working on analyzing the data. So essentially that's the idea that you have a bunch of different trips or pieces of data in front of you, and more than one expert or scholar goes through the data and codes it. So the idea is that hopefully you can get consistency across coders, and so that strengthens the design of your study. Likely in your action research project, for those of you who are doing qualitative research, you will probably be the only coder. However, if you have a colleague or your supervisor or something like that, somebody like that is also interested in the project, you might also invite them to help you code the data. An important thing to do in your qualitative research proposals is to make sure you explain who is going to be coding the data. So that's back to the idea of, remember, like sort of the subjectivity that you're bringing to the table as a researcher. So if it's you and somebody else, you should also explain their role and how they'll be approaching sort of this research topic and perhaps their biases. But the idea behind it is getting reliability across coders. So hopefully, if I'm doing something as academic rigor and you're the other coder on the project, you would also code the same segment as academic rigor. So this is the idea of intra-coder reliability. The idea of intra-coder reliability is that you as a single coder is approaching the data in the same way, and you are seeing patterns across segments that are consistent, so that if you see something that's referring to maybe use of technology, you would consistently code that as perhaps innovation or something like that. So that's the idea of intra-coder reliability. So basically that's another strategy to improve the quality of your qualitative study. In terms of the coding process itself, so there are, and Creswell described, there are three sort of steps when you go about coding from a grounded theory perspective. And this is the perspective or the approach that I learned when I was in school, so that's kind of why I'm going to emphasize it here for you. And it's actually a lot easier than it seems. There's a lot of technical terms that Creswell threw around, but hopefully I'll make it a little bit clearer and easier for you to understand in this presentation. So first of all, the first step you take in qualitative coding from a grounded theory approach is open coding. So that's essentially what I explained the idea of coding in the prior slide. You just go through, you read your transcripts line by line, and you identify code concepts in your data, typically in the margin if you're using, kind of like a typical Word document transcript. So that's just describing what you're seeing and kind of summarizing the segments into conceptual codes. Very much descriptive. The next step, after you're done open coding, so going through and writing those codes in the margins, is to identify patterns across and among those codes. And that's the idea of axial and selective coding. So I'm going to go into more detail into those two and give you some examples in the subsequent slides. But essentially the idea is that you first start by open coding, then you go, after you're finished open coding, you go to axial coding and trying to see how your open codes are related to one another. And then finally, selective coding is just overall identifying sort of the main core essence of your research and answering your research questions. So let me give you an example. So remember that phenomenological study that I referenced in last week's presentation. It was a study by Iwamoto et al., and they looked at the meaning that was ascribed to rap music by Midwestern college students. So what they did is, in reference to open coding, so they first went through all of their interview transcripts, and they identified 4 key open codes that clustered around the different dimensions of meaning that music had for Midwestern college students. So, and then they explain all that in their results section, but then they also created a nice table, and here's a excerpt from that table that summarized the open codes. So here, the first code was identification. The second code down here in the middle, you can see, is psychological impact. And then they also had hip-hop culture and misunderstood genre as open codes, but I didn't copy all of the table, so that's not in here. But what they did that was nice, and you might consider doing this in your qualitative action research project, is that they had their code listed, and then underneath, they selected out a couple of different data segments, so direct quotes, from their transcripts that sort of represented that code. So you can see under identification, they have 5 different quotes there that represent this idea of identification. So that's a really nice approach to presenting your results pertaining to open codes. So then after you open code, you axial code. So essentially axial coding is summarizing and making sense of your results. So one helpful tip that you can use when you go to axial code is what's called enumerating your codes. Essentially that is quantifying your data. It's also called quantitizing. So maybe you'll count the number of times a word appears in a document, or you'll count the number of times a code or a category is used. So that gives information to you as a researcher, as well as to your audience of your research, as to the amount or frequency or quantity of how the codes were emerging in your data set. Maybe in, let's say the hip-hop study, maybe identification came out, 6 times in the interviews, but then hip-hop culture came out 12 times. So while both of those codes were seen as important to talk about and highlight as open coding, maybe hip-hop culture was relatively more frequently mentioned. And so that would be something that's helpful as part of axial coding in terms of analyzing your data. Another part of axial coding is looking for relationships among your codes. There are 2 typical ways that researchers do that, either through what's called hierarchies or through diagrams. So I'm going to give you examples of both of those on the next 2 slides. So hierarchies, codes may be placed in hierarchies. Essentially that is organizing your codes into levels or defining their relationships. So up on the screen is a table with several different types of hierarchies or relationships that codes might take. So one that's pretty common is the first one, strict inclusion. So essentially it's like that one of the codes that you found is always kind of another code. So for instance, let's say an example of that would be maybe you're doing a study of students' academic experiences. So maybe you go through data and you found a consistent code you highlighted was learning communities, and another code that you identified in your open coding was academic integration. So maybe you decide, hey, wait a minute, it seems to me as though learning communities are a kind of academic integration. So that one code is a kind of or fits into the other code. So identifying those relationships. Maybe also a lot of times we see cause and effect. That's number 3 up there. So you'll go through and you'll say, oh, wow, I see that I see high school experiences emerging as a common theme. And so now I also had, academic integration as another common open code. So maybe high school experiences cause academic integration. So you're trying to get at those relationships among your codes. So what I really like to do as part of as part of axial coding is diagramming relationships among codes. I'm kind of a visually oriented thinker, and I think this really helps to move forward in a qualitative data analysis in terms of after you get your codes identified and open coded, you make a sketch or a drawing or some kind of outline to show how something's working, the process that you're observing, or to clarify relationships between parts of a whole. So I'm going to give you an example of how that hip-hop study axial coded and use diagramming on the next slide. Okay, so here's what they did. So remember I said that there were 4 different open codes that Iwamoto et al. Really emphasized. So they put those 4 codes in those 4 boxes seen in the middle, and then they also added different dimensions of sort of differences that they saw also emerging related to those codes. So you can see how they diagrammed all of those interrelationships and difference using arrows and boxes, and kind of their overall idea, shared essence at the top was kind of the overall construct that they were trying to accomplish. And then they saw that there were different attributes or aspects of that, those 4 different boxes, those main open codes that they saw. And then they also had seen probably coded differences based on depth of meaning as well as types of listeners. So then they integrated that into their diagram. And then they put this into their results section in their study. And important to do as you're writing up your research report, if you do use diagramming, you need to explain it in the text. Don't just put a picture in there and assume that your readers will totally understand it. So you need to contextualize and explain in your text whatever diagrams you've developed. But they really can be helpful and powerful tools when you're axial coding. So then finally, an example of selective coding. So again, selective coding is pulling together sort of the overall themes and results that have emerged from your open coding and your axial coding. So Iwamoto et al. Had a really nice table that they put into their paper that is sort of their selective coding of the overall meaning of rap music. And so what is important when you get to selective coding? And you'll see up here, so they have this paragraph in this table that basically explains the important dimensions of rap music in terms of how it makes meaning for students. And what you'll notice is that this is important. It's in their own words. There are no direct quotes from their respondents in the coding. So in the selective coding, it's all put into their own sort of synthesized results. So at the end of the day, if you are using a grounded theory approach to coding, you'll have a final sort of synopsis that represents the main idea or the main sort of conclusion that you from your research through selective coding. Something that Creswell talks about in his chapter, and that I also just want to note for you, is that there are a number of computer programs that researchers use for qualitative data analysis. So I actually put in the supplemental section of Blackboard a link to a demo of NVivo. I've used NVivo for my research, but the other ones are just as good, just as useful. In terms of for your action research, you probably aren't going to need to use a computer program. Using just Word or Excel will be fine. This is when you sort of get to a big, huge qualitative study where you have lots of different sources of data, maybe observational data, maybe video data, maybe transcripts, documents all kinds of things, and these computer programs really help you to keep track of and keep those all organized. So in terms of your action research projects, they're not probably large enough scale to necessitate using one of these programs, but if you do want, I encourage you, go ahead, try it out, watch the demo of In Vivo, and think about perhaps using one of these. But trust me, you don't need to for the sort of expectations of this course at least. Okay, and then I want to finally kind of wrap this up by talking about the idea of a qualitative study. So qualitative researchers don't really think about the idea of reliability and validity and study strength in the same way as quantitative researchers. As we've talked about, or as I mentioned in the prior presentation regarding sort of the philosophy of knowledge, a lot of qualitative researchers reject the framework of validity because they really reject basic idea of positivism, and that there isn't really a reality external to any given single individual person's perception of it. So they don't really think the idea of truth or false or sort of objectivity is that important to acknowledge or think about in the context of a qualitative study. So qualitative researchers typically argue for different standards for judging the overall quality of their research. And so what I think in terms of avoiding bias in your qualitative design, you don't have to think about it in the same way as quantitative studies in terms of being like, oh my gosh, did I prove this? Or sort of, is this right? Is this wrong? The more you want to think about it is just the strength of your study and the idea of corroborate and validating your overall findings in terms of trying to make sure that you're just being trustworthy in terms of what you're presenting. And so my biggest thing in terms of the idea of avoiding bias, I don't think anyone can ever avoid bias in any research. It's just really important to be upfront and honest about your own positionality and what you did in the study. The more information you give, I think the stronger your study is overall. This table has a couple of specific strategies that qualitative researchers typically use to strengthen their studies. In addition to the idea of acknowledging your own positionality and being really upfront about sort of how you're approaching the topic, something else that I want to emphasize or highlight here is the idea of triangulation. So triangulation is essentially drawing from multiple different sources to support your vision. Essentially, it's the idea that, so you shouldn't just do one interview and call it a day. So do multiple interviews or draw from multiple different data sources to kind of back up and validate and triangulate the themes that have emerged. So maybe, you're doing some interviews of graduate students about their perceptions of higher education program policies and procedures. And maybe they're all complaining, oh my gosh, it's totally ridiculous. We're required to take a practicum course. And so maybe then you would go to the program handbook and check out the policies there and see how the policy around practicum course requirements is framed and presented by the program. That kind of thing. So triangulate, when possible, the themes that are emerging from your interviews, as well as triangulate the fact that themes are emerging across different sources of data. That's the idea of triangulation. In your data analysis section, you would say, okay, so I triangulated the findings that I got from my interviews with the policy and procedure manual from the program. Sometimes you can't do that, but a lot of times at least you can triangulate across multiple interview participants or respondents, right? So that's important, the idea of triangulation. So this presentation has come to an end. Hopefully the idea of analyzing qualitative data makes a little bit more sense to you. It's actually a lot more complex and technical than I think people give it credit for. Just because it doesn't involve numbers and statistics doesn't mean it's not difficult. So in class, what we're going to do is spend some time workshopping through your qualitative proposal designs, as well as I'll answer any questions you might have about this week's lectures. This is actually week 6, that's wrong on the slide. And then I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice analyzing, quoting qualitative data using some data that I collected from a project a couple years ago. And then finally, if we have time, I'd like to critique some ASH proposals that I reviewed a couple years ago that used qualitative research. So if you'll remember, we critiqued the quantitative one a couple weeks ago, and I have some qualitative ones that I'd like to critique if we have time. So I look forward to seeing you in class.